I'd like to give a very special thank you to my friend, the attorney Reverend Jeanette Wilson. Yesterday was her birthday, and she worked right through her birthday preparing for the King holiday weekend. I see my friend here from DC, Brother McMorris, thank you so much. And from Pembroke, the good doctor, Dr. Alford, a man who is a champion, very much like that, the spirit of Dr. Howard. Our good friend Teddy Gilmore, Dr. Howard came up from Mississippi, had to be hidden in a casket, standing for civil rights. And when there were civil rights meetings to be had in Chicago, a medical doctor opened up his house to greet Reverend Martin Luther King and Mayor Richard Hatchett and so many others. I would like to speak with you today and welcome good to see my brother Jesse Jr. here as always, and my father just came in from Los Angeles today. I'll tell you the truth, I'm more excited about King holiday than my own birthday. I feel like I get a bonus because my birthday is January 7th and Martin Luther King's is January 15th, so I celebrate all the way through, from one person to the other. But I think it's very important today that we talk about three things: the need to commemorate this day, the need to celebrate his life, and the need to accept and further the challenge that he laid before us. In the Harris polls of 1968, Reverend Martin Luther King was hated. He had a 75% disapproval rate, if you will, and you compare that to today, the person in the White House today is more popular than Reverend Martin Luther King when he died. What did Reverend Martin Luther King stand for? We must revisit, and we must share this with our children. I ask those of you that are watching and listening today, please gather your children. I need to fix this problem top down. Some solutions you can fix bottom up, and some things you have to fix top down. Some of you like to cook, and those of you that like to barbecue like I do, you understand one thing about a good piece of meat. Sometimes, no matter the preparation you make and the time that you put into it, if you've had a bad piece of meat, it's just not going to come out good. It's hard to come out right when you go in something wrong. Relationships and everything, correct? It's hard to understand Martin Luther King. If you approach him wrong, you can't get to understand him the right way. I remember when my first child was born. Follow me? And the first lie I told my child that I participated in that had my stomach turning upside down was about a Santa Claus. I was taking the children to Sunday school, and the popular world says, but there's Santa Claus and the Christmas tradition of jolly old St. Nicholas. And I said, but I'm lying to my child. How am I expected to teach my child something about faith? And then I make a mockery out of it with a jolly old heavy-set, portly man that comes from the North Pole with some elves and goes through chimneys all around the neighborhood, even when people live in apartment buildings with no chimneys. You put your child in a state of cognitive dissonance where the child is trying to reconcile fact from fiction because we've introduced lies into the curriculum. How can it be that this child that was born in a stable and placed in the manger, in the trough where the horses eat so he wouldn't fall out, who the king wanted to kill, that had to send people that were spiritually bound from the east, that followed their soul, their instincts, to bring gifts of frankincense and myrrh and gold so the child could escape, so he would not be killed? How did a child born under a death warrant end up being made about toys and gifts and not helping the homeless and the families of the immigrants, the migrants, and those that are left in the margins? A teenage mother with an unemployed father miraculously has a child. Then you look up at Easter time. We go back to tell our children that the child that became a man that we acknowledge as the Son of God is now equated to jelly beans, Easter eggs, and a Snow White bunny running through your yard. It's a bit much. Well, as it relates to the Reverend Martin Luther King Day, I'm beginning to see the same thing happen over again in my lifetime. A man that did not have bodyguards, did not have security guards, did not work for the city, the county, or the state, did not have any of the tools of government. What did he do? He believed in that Bible. The same Bible that some people had misconstrued and used for bad. He saw the good in that Bible. He saw liberation as a theology. He saw nonviolence as a tactic. He saw love as a weapon that we could use to liberate ourselves from a slave-bidden, slave-born society. Those that have lived and worked with the Reverend Martin Luther King, John Conyers, who recently passed, Mayor Richard Gordon Hatchard, who recently passed, my father who's standing strong. Those persons that lived and worked with him, they had a commonality. They never stopped fighting. Now I see the misappropriation, the counterfeiting of the Reverend Martin Luther King holiday. Let me pick it apart just for a moment so I can recreate it so you'll understand. When you call him Dr. Martin Luther King, that's a problem. Although affectionate, doctor is for a dissertation. It's a terminal degree, the highest you can get in academia. But there is a title, a salutation greater than doctor. That's when you're called the Reverend. When the judge comes in, you stand up in the courtroom. When you go to church and the Reverend starts to preach and you open the Bible, you are asking for a call, vocational calling from God to help illuminate and open up these words. He is the Reverend Martin Luther King. Once you were a senator, were a governor, and you end up as the president, your highest salutation is president. Once you were a cardinal and you end up as the pope, your highest salutation is the pope. When you become the reverend, that is the highest salutation than the doctor. So by not saying Reverend Martin Luther King, by having a reverend on the mall in Washington, D.C., without one reference, one quote that he's made acknowledging God is a problem.
That's right.
Why? Because they never wanted to see our humanity. They never wanted to see us in a noble light. He gave our race, he gave our culture, he gave our history dignity. Part of what you see that goes on every day on TV is there's 1,000 ways to take away our dignity and our respect. That is calculated. They all want to see us entertaining. They all want to see us smiling. They always want to see us shucking. They always want to see us jovial. They always want to see us non-cerebral and serious. What did the Reverend Martin Luther King do? He found a tactic and a tool that we could use to break this slaveocracy. Here is a man whose father, Daddy King, was born in Stockbridge, Georgia, who at 14 years of age and needed glasses and couldn't quite read, was trying to get a job on the train stop so he could make some money and come back and give his family something. Daddy King had a bit of a temper when he saw the man that his father had to deliver the cotton to take his father's money, and Daddy King would say, "But Daddy, what about the seed money from the cotton?" And the white man told him, "Shut up." He said, "But Daddy, he's got your seed money. There's a profit in there." His family had come from the lineage of those that had been sharecropping, overworked, underpaid, and systematically robbed. Why do we come to commemorate the Reverend Martin Luther King today? Because our children will be confused. He's an extraordinary man, yet an ordinary man. A man who went to school, who had some juvenile challenges with his own mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. A man that went to college at 15. A man who laughed and joked and lived and breathed. Why am I telling you this? Because I don't want you to put Reverend Martin Luther King on a pedestal above being a human being. Because if you do, then you use that as an excuse for you not to do anything yourself. He made a conscious choice to fight for justice. He could have given great sermons, masterful orator, master as a reverend, but he saw that the liberation was in the gospel was a tool. He didn't want to leave us with fanciful, beautiful stories of 2,000 years ago. He wanted us to believe that the Bible has a living word, not a dead word. I don't want to look up and talk about Bible stories and fairyland from 2,000 years ago. I want to use the instructions and the words there to help me today so I can get to tomorrow. You can get into a slave mentality of reading and looking back and saying all power is out of my hand. He understood our Constitution, the law, and he understood a law greater than man's law, and that's God's law. Because everything that's legal is not moral. Legality is the lowest end. Morality is higher. You should stop before you get to a certain point, not when you get caught by the law. Instead of thou shalt not kill, when you've got your moral compass on, you should say thou shalt not argue with a fool. So long before you wanted to kill somebody, you should have walked away and said, that's a fool, and let them be wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, why do we come to commemorate the Reverend Martin Luther King? This was the idea, the brainchild of the great late Representative John Conyers, who worked with Reverend Martin Luther King. And when Martin Luther King died, Mr. Conyers, a thinker, who signed more progressive legislation than anyone in American history, 50 years an honorable man. I'm not going to let you knock his reputation. I'm not going to let you talk about he had a stain on his character. He was unblemished. He was a soldier. He was a fighter. He was a veteran. He was a legislator and an honorable and dignified man. I know some of our young people don't know about Toys R Us anymore. Walmart sells more toys than Toys R Us. But a friend of mine, Eddie Reed, called me yesterday and he says, you know, some of these people are like action Toys R Us figures. I said, what is that? He says every time they create a Marvel character or one of these cartoon characters, Toys R Us used to come back out with a character of a G.I. Joe, of a toy that we could play with and embrace. Some people in the activist community today are just G.I. Joe action-packed figures. They come up for a season. But the people that loved and worked with the Reverend Martin Luther King, they fought all of their lives and never stopped. Why do we come to commemorate Reverend Martin Luther King? Because he liberated us all. What was the solution to being a minority in a majority country that was born out of slavery, that was attacking and unprosecuting lynchings, that was buying and selling children, a society that did not regard us as human beings for 246 years. You could not marry, have a name. You could not out-weaponize them. He found in the work of Dr. Mahatma Gandhi soul force, the satyagraha, the soul force that you needed to have resolution. Mr. Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Henry David Thoreau in his treatise on civil disobedience. Civil rights and our civil disobedience comes out of not participating in something evil. So what happened in Montgomery was a restraint of trade. When we were boycotted, Reverend Martin Luther King says, let us not participate in something evil. Let us restrain our trade and not be subjected to humiliation. We have to tell our story, ladies and gentlemen. I look at the news every day and I'm heartbroken like you when I see the crimes. Our children simply don't know where we've come from, what we've been through. We're not weak, we're survivors. We're not victims, we're survivors. We've made it over the toughest periods. and we're going to make it through the times of today. Why do we come to commemorate? Because no African American had ever been considered worthy of a national holiday. John Conyers specifically wanted to give the meritorious salutation and honor. The greatest thing a nation can do to honor someone is to give them a national holiday. That was strategic. That was not coincidental. That was not accidental. That was very deliberate. And there are only two federal recognized days in the name of an individual where the markets are closed: Columbus Day and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He proposed that legislation 4 days after Reverend Martin Luther King was dead, after he was killed, assassinated. And it went on until 1983 when President Reagan signed the legislation for it to be enacted to have a federal holiday in 1986. But guess what? The markets did not recognize it. After Jimmy Carter tried to have the federal vote brought before the Congress in '79, it was denied. Then there's a young man, Stephen Morris. You know him affectionately as Stevie Wonder. When the soul and the science and the movement came together, he rewrote that horrible song, Happy Birthday to You, to say, happy birthday. He put some soul in it that ignited our passion and our soul. He brought us all together. Then it officially went into the being in 1986. 17 states had already enacted the King holiday legislation. But we were confused. Should we work? Should we not work? Should we go to school, not go to school? The markets were open. It wasn't until 1998 when I was with my father, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a friend of the great John Conyers. He says something is wrong on why people can't take a day off. And I said, Dad, the markets are open. That's the reason the banks are open. I said, I don't know why that is. We went to see Chairman Dick Grosso of the New York Stock Exchange. He went to see Sanford Weill, the world's largest banker at that time, and he asked them in 111 Wall Street, why is the market open on the day of Reverend Martin Luther King's birthday? And Chairman Dick Grosso said, I don't know, we've never thought about it. He says, this is a private member organization. Let me get back to you on that. I've got to poll the membership. Within 24 hours, Chairman Dick Grosso came back up and told my father, Reverend Jesse Jackson, the New York Stock Exchange unanimously voted to close the markets. That is why a black man's name is closing the markets on King Holiday. Private sector. The New York Stock Exchange has $30 trillion worth of value in stocks. The New York Stock Exchange does over $170 billion in value every day. This is why the market is closed on King Holiday. What I don't want you to be confused on is on the misappropriation, like Easter, like Christmas on the King Holiday. Those that are in office now want us to have a day of service. They tell you to clean up bathrooms, go help a neighbor, go get some garbage and all that. Let me tell you, you should do that every day without a King Holiday. But if you want to honor the Reverend Martin Luther King, make yourself re-energized, refocused. Make this a renewal point, a time for you to commemorate, to come back and say, what am I going to give of my life? Not what am I going to give of my hour? What am I going to give of my day? What are you going to give of your life? We celebrate a man who was criticized and killed. We celebrate a man that went to jail 29 times to make America better. We celebrate a man who was a minister. He is the only non-elected official, the only non-general, non-politician. He is the only minister to have a mall erected in Washington, D.C. Why is Rainbow Push set up on Saturday morning? We have the form and the features and the feel of a church, but it's about carrying on Reverend Martin Luther King's message and his life work. Why are we focused on Pembroke, Illinois? Because Reverend Martin Luther King was focused on anti-war, anti-violence, and he was focused on a war on poverty, not a war on the poor. Pembroke has been robbed. Many of those that have the heirs of state and black farmers, they've been robbed. We have to stay focused on the life and the working of the poor. Poor not meaning you don't work. Poor means you don't have enough income to cover all of your bills. Poor means you cannot accumulate any assets. Poor means you're being overcharged at a currency exchange. Poor means you're getting overdraft fees from the bank. Poor means you never get satisfied with credit approval. Poor means you pay more interest rates than anyone else. Poor means your insurance rates are higher than anyone else. Poor means your house is probably teetering on foreclosure because you can't get refinanced. Poor means they're checking in on your credit score and denying you a job. Poor means you can't get out of bail for a nonviolent offender. Now, you know, like I know, many more people have been arrested, locked up, jailed for circumstantial evidence. The law is thrown at black folks. And lo and behold, what do we see in Washington, D.C. today? They play with guidelines, rules. They just throw the law at us, bam, all guilty. First you're guilty, and then you got to fight to prove you're innocent. How many times you look up every week and see another person getting out of jail after 20 years? What took so long? The assumption was they were guilty. If they weren't guilty, well, they were going to be guilty. If they weren't going to be guilty, they did something we don't know about, and that's the way it is. That's wrong. If King were alive, he would talk about the strikes going on in Mississippi today at the jail, where the people are being degraded and left for dead, and prisoners are killing each other, and the state is turned the other way. If King were alive today, he would talk about voter suppression. He died making sure that we had the right to vote. He would talk about the public housing crisis that we're facing and the elder care that our society is challenged to. So if you go to a King event and you do not leave out of there uncomfortable, you probably went to the wrong event. King wanted to make sure that he challenged challenged our faith, challenged us to go into action. Something about comforting the disturbed and disturbing those that are too comfortable. 140 million people are now living and working in poverty in the United States. The New York Stock Exchange is making record highs, but the people are in record lows. They said unemployment is down. Sure, it can be down, but when the living wage is so low, you cannot afford to work your way out of poverty. You have masqueraded and hidden the true measure and the index of poverty. Oh, it's time for us to open our blinds, open our eyes, open our hearts. In closing, when I tell you I'm so pleased on the King holiday, a time that we need to make sure our children set aside, not their birthday. What's my birthday about? What have I done? What's your birthday about? I hope it means more. But I want my life to have meaning. And when I see a life that has meaning, I want to take the time to be able to set aside a holy place. Our children can't see anything bigger than themselves. That's a problem. Reverend Martin Luther King did not start the civil rights era. He participated in another civil rights era in the 60s. There was one before that in the 20s. There was one before that in the 1860s. This is a constant battle. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you in the challenge, have you ever voted? Have you ever voted? Have you ever missed a vote? Have you ever encouraged someone to vote? Have you ever picked someone up and driven them to the polls on voting day? Have you ever called off on King Day and told your boss, told your employers, I've got something that I honor, that I respect. I cannot come in tomorrow, on Monday, or on that day? Have you ever sacrificed and said, I'm not going to spend any money on this King Day. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to hold these dollars that are itching to get out of my pocket. I'm going to hold back on this debit card that may bounce because I'm going to delay this purchase. I'm going to join a civil rights organization. I'm going to take my child to a King event. I'm going to have my child committed to social justice. And you can be successful. I don't want your child to come around. And there's so many brilliant children and so many families doing the right things. But our children don't know how to fight. My father's generation, they didn't complain. They fought back. People want to come up to my father, give him a resume. I want you to see this. Can you make a private call? And all that he asks is that we come together for a collective action. This isn't about you. This is about us. King wanted us to move beyond sanctimonious trivialities and religious irrelevancies. Can you believe the Lord that we praise, God, Jesus, he never heard the word Christian? He was a Jewish child, right? And when he died, the scriptures go on to say. Can you believe he never heard of the AMEs? Can you believe he never heard of the CMEs and the Baptists and the culture? Can you believe he's never heard of all these things that we have put together in place of his name? He wanted us to be combined for universal love. And I want you to know that I am so proud of my father for having never dropped the banner that he picked up from the Reverend Martin Luther King. It's hard to get some of us to come out for an hour a week in the name of the Reverend Martin Luther King. It's very difficult to have us buy a membership to any civil rights organization. Not your society, and I encourage you to do that with your sorority and your fraternity and your other organizations. But what have you committed to civil rights? When the Trayvon Martins get killed and you know we're upset and we ought to say something, who's to say it if we haven't invested in the vehicle for our own liberation? Why are we upset when the 257 News, the networks don't cover us? Who wants to see us free? Martin Luther King is my hero. My father, my hero. Let us stop exalting the dead and burying the living in the name and the respect of the Reverend Martin Luther King. Join a cause, participate, contribute, give of your time, talent, and your treasure, and we can make a difference.